So when you see an adverse event in the emergency room in the clinic, the first thing you want to do is to reassure the person. You want to reduce external stimuli, and you want to just basically provide supportive care. You really want to avoid any intrusive, invasive procedures unless it is unclear to you what they've ingested or how much they've ingested. If you do need symptomatic treatment with medicines, first-line treatment is with benzos or atypical antipsychotics. The atypicals, particularly, I looked over Stahl before I came over here, and I think it's Wiegand and Zyprexa that have not only serotonin 2A blocking activity, but also serotonin 2C blocking activity. All the atypicals have 2A blocking, but it's those two that have also affinity for the 2C. So it might make sense to use those as first line. If that doesn't work, then you want to use a serotonin antagonist such as ritonserin for treatment. Now we'll talk about flashbacks. The definition or the description of flashbacks is transient, spontaneous recurrences of the psychedelic drug experience. That's not a fast and true rule. Some flashbacks, or particularly perceptual disturbances like we see in perceptual disturbance disorder, can be just long-term, non-remitting. The incidence of flashbacks varies widely in the literature. The range is anywhere from 15 to 77%. And I think one reason for that, that wideness, that variation in the incidence numbers, is because flashbacks aren't necessarily a bad thing, that there are users out there who can have very positive, pleasant flashbacks. That's why one of the terms amongst users for a flashback is a free trip. One thing that we do know is that flashbacks, at least the unpleasant sort that psychiatrists are usually called in to treat, because we usually don't get called in for the good flashbacks. Flashbacks are more likely in people with pre-existing psychopathology and also with a greater degree of suggestibility. What exactly causes these things is unknown. Some hypotheses include that flashbacks, particularly those that are emotional, are a kind of PTSD reaction to a very strong emotional event. Certainly somebody who has a bad trip, that can be considered traumatic if it's bad enough. But again, talking about positive experiences, if someone has a very strong positive experience of any sort, that can also be attached to or related to re-experiencing or having strong memories of that positive event. And you don't need to have, take psychedelics to have a strong positive event occur in your life. Also, some other ideas are that the persisting perception disorder is a form of visual seizure. There's also an idea that maybe flashbacks are a conditioned response to arousal, that maybe flashbacks are exacerbations of personality features that were there to begin with. Or a more psychodynamic explanation is that the person's defensive ego functions are incapable of suppressing unacceptable memories of conflicts that were brought on during the experience. Treatment of flashbacks includes using SSRIs, atypical antipsychotics, clonidine, and clonazepam. The latter two actually have more evidence in the literature these days than the former two, so clonidine and clonazepam are actually first-line treatment for flashbacks. And then finally, we talk about what is probably the most serious adverse effect, which is hallucinogen-induced psychosis. And this, of course, is psychosis preceded by known use of hallucinogenic drugs. The incidence of psychosis is, the mean incidence is 2.7%. The range is 0.08 to 4.6%. And it's very important to note that that is in a controlled setting, in a clinical or research setting. Now, the lower end of the range, towards the 0.08 number, that was in normal, healthy volunteer populations. The larger end occurred more in populations with pre-existing psychiatric disorders. Psychosis is associated with poor premorbid functioning, which kind of makes sense. History of psych illness, again, kind of makes sense. And polydrug abuse. So what we're talking about here is a kind of diathesis model where somebody has a pre-existing biological predisposition to psychosis that is uncovered by the chemical and or psychological effects of the drug. A more chemical etiology is that there's a lot of serotonin aggregations. So the hallway in the emergency room is definitely not a place for these people, but they get put there anyway. And if you need to calm them down in the acute phase, benzos and atypicals are again first-line treatment. Here's the part where you get to win a free beer. First person who can name this guy gets a free beer. Very good. Very good. So if you come to happy hour, you get a free beverage. This is Syd Barrett, who is one of the founding members of Pink Floyd. I was going to talk a lot about him, but I figured it would be kind of unprofessional because nobody really knows what happened with Syd. All we know is that he was one of the founding members of Pink Floyd, and somewhere around 1967 started developing really odd behavior. And God knows why that was, but some people tend to attribute that to lots and lots of acid. So finally, we're going to mosey on to history of use. First going to talk about psilocybin. Psilocybin was used ritually in Central and South America. There are cave paintings in those areas with mushrooms very prominently displayed, dating back to about 5000 BC. So use of psychedelic intoxicants goes back pretty far in history. There's historical evidence that the Mixtecs and later the Aztecs used psilocybin in their religious rituals. The Aztecs called psilocybin mushrooms teonanacatl. Am I pronouncing that right? Anybody? I'm looking at you, Francisco. Say it for me. Teonanacatl. Okay, cool. So anyways, that translates literally to flesh of the gods, or it was also called the wondrous mushroom. So all this was going on until the Europeans came along, the conquistadors, and they didn't like the looks of anything that was not purely Christian, so they forbid its use among the natives. Nonetheless, the Aztecs continued to use the mushrooms in secret ceremonies, and in the mid-16th century, a monk named Bernardino de Sahagún, I hope I'm saying that one right too, but described an Aztec mushroom ritual in his writings. By the early 20th century, because the mushroom cults, the mushroom religions had gone underground, Americans and Europeans actually debated the existence of psychedelic mushrooms. There was a school of thought that thought that Sahagún had mistaken dried peyote buttons for mushrooms. But in the 1930s, a guy named Robert Whiteliner observed a Mazatec mushroom ceremony, and then it wasn't too long before, in 1955, two guys named Wasson and Richardson were the first white boys to participate in a mushroom ceremony. They went to a woman named Maria Sabina, who was a Mazatec curandera, and she shared with them the secrets of the magic mushroom, which was the name of the 1957 article that Wasson wrote for Life magazine. In that same year, Albert Hofmann isolated psilocybin and psilocin, the active ingredients in psychedelic mushrooms, and invented a technique for synthesizing those chemicals in the laboratory. Now we move on to mescaline, which, as I said, is the active ingredient in peyote cactuses. There's evidence of use of mescaline dating back to 1000 BC, a little further north than psilocybin in the areas that are now Mexico and Texas. But once again, the conquistadors came along and thought that the natives were practicing a kind of witchcraft, so forbid the use of peyote buttons. So it took till 1845 for European botanists to classify peyote. In 1887, this is really interesting, Parke Davis distributed dried peyote buttons for medicinal use. Is there anybody here from Parke Davis today?
Pfizer owns them now.
Oh, really? Oh, I'll have to talk to our Pfizer dudes. Cool. So then in the late 1800s, we saw a spread of peyote use northerly into the mainly Native American populations. In 97, mescaline was isolated by Arthur Hefter, and in 1919, a method was found to synthesize it in the lab. In 1918, the Native American